Welcome back. Most of you I think we're welcoming most of you back who are with us on Zoom live, but of course these sessions are being recorded, so there may be some people watching them later on YouTube as well. So I should mention that I have with me Anthony Nansen, who earlier this morning was delighting us with some stories with a real impact about how we relate with the environment. And now we're going to turn mainly to Martin Palmer in the red and Brother Alasdair Kay in the brown. And our topic for this part of the morning is faiths and our shared world. If you have already heard the first in this series of Zooms, then you'll have heard Martin Palmer talk a bit about his work internationally and across many faiths. We'll be coming back to that, but Alasdair wasn't with us yesterday when we did that. And most of your involvement is on a much more local basis. Yeah. But I know you're very committed to this issue and this cause. How come? How did you first awaken to the state of the world?
Yeah, I think I've been a Franciscan now for about 14 years, so most of my early years was in the Third Order of the Society of St. Francis. And I'd sort of listened to the environmentalist calls and, you know, felt sort of like many people of, oh yes, that's a bit, yes, what do we do about that? Oh, too massive, can't be participator in that. And besides of which I was struggling with trying to stop the church going down the plug hole. So that was very nice setting, and I got to the point in life where I really need to take a break. And so in 2016, like many hundreds of thousands of people, I found myself on a plane to Biarritz, and then in a place called Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and found myself for 40 days walking to first Santiago de Compostela, and then to Finisterre and Murcia. And in that...
This is the Camino.
The Camino de Santiago was the beginning for me. And it was the place where I began to really realize that there was a spiritual awakening happening in the world that was not just in my little Christian camp. And 6 of those days I spent walking with a Muslim woman from Australia. And I found myself being very confronted where suddenly I was having to engage with people of other faiths. And more particularly, I was having to realize that I was very connected to this physical planet. And I saw deserts, and I saw mountains, and I saw, you know, all the raft of northern Spain, monocultures wherever I went, and et cetera. So my journey was, I think that's where I began to wake up. I then began to make a journey myself of beginning to decarbonize. And I think that's where I first began. Then I think in 2018, 2019, I became aware of Extinction Rebellion, became involved with Extinction Rebellion or Christian Climate Action, which I was a part of. And I went to my first Heading for Extinction talk. And if I'm honest, I came out terrified. You know, I was like the parrot in the story, terrified, thinking, why are we not all really scared? Then COVID hit. And then I think I began actually to become an activist because it gave me a structure through which to hear from other activists and begin to engage with that. I then realized that things were quite a bit more nuanced. COVID happened. And in that time, I began to read more extensively, began to study more extensively. Then they decided to build an incinerator on my doorstep. And they're still trying to do it now.
This is the proposed incinerator for Portland.
For Portland,
yes.
Yeah. And I realized the environmental impact on it because I lived in Derby where they built an incinerator, and I saw the levels of COPD rise. I became aware that actually we were facing a serious, significant health climate in a very industrialised part of Derby. And so that was where my activism came, because a bit like the parrot, I just couldn't do nothing, and so realised that the scenario was so serious that we're in, that actually really interventionist activism needs to take off. The final penny dropped in September this year. I used to be a cruise ship chaplain once a year for Saga holidays, and I went up to northern Norway. Sorry, so I just need to hold my emotions here. I saw the forest dying.
Forest dying in northern Norway.
Yeah. And I'm trying not to use bad language here. But it was
use whatever language you feel, please.
I remember being on the front of the ship thinking, shit, it's happening. And it jumped off paper, off PowerPoints, off slides, off the television, and I was witnessing it with my own eyes. And that for me was the jump off point, I think, and I thought, actually, activism must be the central thing of what I'm involved in now. So yeah, I think we're in the fight for everything's survival. So it's I don't think it's a thing we can walk away from. So yeah, that's
can I ask you a question? I'm intrigued. You said you've been a Franciscan for 14 years, yet this relationship with nature only happened in 2016. What were you missing for so many years in the Franciscan tradition? And there's a wonderful book I remember written many years ago called Smashing the Bird Bath, setting St. Francis free from the romantic notion of nature. Why was that not feeding you earlier?
Well, I think a lot of it was because I was living in a very urbanized context. I was in a very multicultural inner city parish, and so I saw the old blackbird, but I didn't really live in an area where actually creation was all about. But I think contemplation on the Camino. So while I was walking on the Camino, I was able to spend hours in contemplative prayer as I walked, and I was able to attach myself. It was almost as if, I've been attached to this planet all my 61 years, but it was as if I reattached to the planet that was around me. I saw the God of creation in and through everything that was about me. It moved from the academic and the intellectual to the heart, and ultimately to my feet.
Yes, indeed.
So that was, I would say the Camino was a huge part of my own personal journey. But there's a journey between the waking up to the how do I move to being an activist, and that is a journey I think a lot of the world is in at the moment. I think it's a journey the church has barely begun, and I think some people would challenge it. But for example, at COP26 this year, I did a follow-up challenge publicly over the £80 million that the Church of England has got invested in fossil fuels at the moment. And I personally believe that we need to disinvest. And so to stand up in a public meeting and challenge a bishop, a senior bishop of the Church of England, and say, this is wrong, is actually quite a challenging thing to do. Now, what I found in Christian Climate Action is I am surrounded by other activists, and particularly other priests who are activists, who, dear Reverend Sue Parfit, it seems like there's hardly a week she's not in the High Court.
We were reminded yesterday during our session that she's just recently been let off one particular.
She's been let off twice in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So she's been found not guilty twice in the last 3 weeks for action she engaged in 2019. So there's no doubt that when activists are getting in front of courts where there's a jury, they're getting acquitted. what is happening is the government, the power of the government is still being used to suppress activism. And my good friend Emma Smart from Weymouth has just been released from prison yesterday. Louis McConaughey, who's also in my parish, has just been released from prison as well. And so, the police and crime sentencing bill, I see as one of the most disturbing steps being taken by government at the present time to quell activism of any form whatsoever.
And anybody who heard Jonathan Herbert's interview with us yesterday would know that he was very moved about concerned about the same piece of legislation. Yeah.
It is, because there's a tone that's going on. So whether it's to do with the police and crime sentencing bill, that's very concerning. But equally concerning is the new refugee bill. So what do we do when we hit really the crux of the climate crisis, when suddenly we've got 2.7 billion refugees on our hands, where whole cities are moving away from the coasts? We won't be able to stop the dinghies at Calais. It's contemplating a future which I think puts many of us in a situation where we're like the parrot. And it feels like at times you are talking to monkeys and elephants as an activist.
In case anybody watching this wasn't with us for the previous session when Anthony was telling stories, the parrot and the monkey and the elephant and also the cormorant were key characters in the story with different responses to a crisis. So how is that working out in your rector of a parish just close to Portland, along the coast from Othona? How is that particular campaign working out now?
It's mixed. It's very mixed.
About the incineration, the proposed incineration plant.
Well, it's mixed on several levels. So, it's mixed from the perspective for me as a rector of a church in the parish, in that I have a good number I have people who've left my church over my activism. I have had situations where people really have said, almost campaigned to say, please stop preaching about climate change. So I've, and I feel unable to be quiet. So that's good. In terms of the incinerator itself, yes, I've been at the forefront and been very public in my opposition to the building of the incinerator. In February, it comes up to planning locally, and I expect that some form of direct action will happen around that particular gathering at Dorset Council. It must not go ahead. Plus, it just seems bonkers to build it where they're going to build it in the light of rising sea levels, when we're potentially facing the breaching of the Chesil Bank. It's a local place. If you come to Othona here, you can't miss the Chesil Bank. But if the Chesil Bank is breached and Portland becomes an island, guess what? The incinerator is going to be affected by flooding. So it just seems we are living our lives in such a way as we don't actually think there is a climate emergency. And it's the first emergency I've ever heard declared by councils, by churches, and nobody, it appears that very little, if any, action is taking place. And that for me is profoundly concerning, that, I don't know, I think sane people act in an emergency. It would appear to me. And so that seems to be as a missing piece, is we still haven't woken up. We haven't really grasped where we are. We haven't really engaged with what's coming down the tracks. But I think maybe the parrot is talking to the cormorant, going back to the story. And the story is very helpful that Anthony gave us, in that actually possibly that's where we are at the moment, is the parrot seeing it and is talking to the cormorant, but we're still a long way from the elephant.
The elephant's the most sceptical about the threat in that story. And I think it's one of the ironies of our situation at the moment. And not only you're thinking about the proposal to build this quite close to the sea. But of course, most of the nuclear power plants in this country have been constructed very close to the sea because water cooling was part of the intention. And there will be many people watching this who also know Othona in Essex, our centre at Bramble-on-Sea, which has since the 1950s been just across the fields from a nuclear power station, now decommissioned. But there is a proposal for a much bigger one. That proposal at the moment is stalled because it was going to be built with Chinese involvement and money, and that is no longer politically acceptable. But the likelihood that some kind of new nuclear facility will be put there, again, right by an estuary, couldn't be much closer to the sea. That likelihood has to be high, and it's something that people involved, particularly in the Essex centre of the Othona community, very concerned about that impact, whatever their views about nuclear power in general. Anyway, thank you, Alasdair. I think.
Did you want me to follow up your question on what are we doing about it?
Yeah, by all means.
Well, I think if any people who are looking in who are who go to a local church, I would say move everything you can within your faith congregation to become an eco-church and begin to engage with the eco-church journey. The potentiality to greenwash in this is there in terms of, we tick the boxes and we send off and we get our plaque and we put it on the wall and everybody thinks we're action, but it is a very positive and very constructive way for faith communities to begin to engage with. I think the second thing as well is to those of you who have probably a more Anglican or Roman Catholic or of that tradition where we keep seasons. Creation Tide is a really, really good way to begin to at least preach and particularly worship in such a way as we reconnect to the creation that's around us. So celebrating that period between August the 15th and the 4th of October, I think is a very good way for churches to begin to have creative conversations. And then for any church leaders out there, I have put Eco Church up there with safeguarding. So, in terms of every time a church council meets, we talk about ecology in the same way as we make sure we are keeping to our safeguarding policies, etc., etc., etc. And so, not ever letting it get off the agenda or the burner is absolutely critical. And that's things that I think anybody in any faith community, any church can actually get engaged with. And it begins to get us talking about it, thinking creatively about it, worshipping in such a way that we actually engage around the issue of the creation.
Great, and that's very much starting from the ground up.
Yeah,
from the local congregation, local church community, but you spoke about confronting a bishop on the matter of disinvesting or divesting, some people call it. How far are you finding that the structure of the church higher up is supportive, is enabling of what you're doing, or how much does this need to simply come from more and more action and awareness within local congregations?
Well, I can only talk about the church meeting. I mean, I think church meeting is like a rabbit with it in the headlights at the moment because it's just trying to manage with the financial impact of COVID. I mean, that's the reality. There's been no intervention from anywhere, and so many churches are seeing up to 30% of their congregations not returning from COVID. So that at the moment they're like rabbits, and it's like too big, too scary. How are we going to manage this one? And so I think it is the ground up has got to put huge pressure. And I don't mind doing it. I just embarrass people over it. And I won't let it go away. And there's an element where I think there's some people who just got to be a pain in the backside. But at the other side, you do need a circle of friends around you who will keep nudging and keep pushing and being absolutely resolute. I mean, it's like dealing with racism or gender or sexuality, of all those kind of things. You just cannot stop the pressure on that. So that would be the first thing. So And I think the first thing is you've got to call out the greenwashing and the BS, because that is going on still at the moment. There is huge levels, I feel, within the Church of England of
just paying lip service.
Well, it's one of the 5 marks of mission. It's not an actual existential crisis that we're walking through together as humanity. So that I feel is something that I find that deeply concerning. So yeah, I think the wheels will grind slowly if we hit our 2030 target of being net zero as a church. It's going to take a miracle in the next 5 years. It's going to take an absolute miracle, because the vast buildings have got to decarbonize. It's that. We set a goal, and I'm excited about the goal, but I just don't see much, if any, energy being applied to us attaining this goal. And so we're not talking about it. Actually, it's not just about being nice and being green. It's about our survival.
Can I put in a question there? With the climate change crisis, and the lack of sort of deep belief in it to the extent of motivating a response, it kind of strikes me as having some similarity in a way to a religious claim. So that, for example, when I was at university, I would experience people, sort of evangelical people, who would talk about the existential threat, if you like, of death and of going to hell, and therefore this is such a big deal. You must respond to this, and then most people would ignore them, and it seems to me that with the nature of climate change you've had that experience of seeing those forests in Norway, but it's at the moment different things happening in different places as actual physical realities. But the general paradigm of climate change is theorized, it's produced by computer models, and therefore it requires a kind of trust and faith in the scientists, the climate scientists, in the same way as a religious claim requires a faith and a trust in the religious teachers and the scriptures. And so there's a kind of leap. And the pandemic is interesting, because the pandemic is something that has, where a theoretical idea, because it's been mooted for many years that something like this could happen, and people didn't really believe it, take it seriously, and now it's happening. Most people do believe it's happening and are responding in various ways, although there is still a fraction of people who don't even believe it's happening.
40,000 on the street.
But the thing is that the pandemic is, I would see it as a kind of biting point of the general ecological crisis, of which climate change is a part as well. But what's happened in the public discourse is it's got separated out from the ecological crisis. So it's presented as a health crisis, which is definitely, we can see it's definitely happening, because lots of people are dying and lots of people are sick. And therefore, we really do have to take these measures, but it's not framed as part of the ecological crisis. And so the ecological crisis is still kind of sitting there as this kind of theoretical paradigm where you still have to trust the experts rather than believing in it as a physical present reality.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the most frightening parts of the wake up was recognizing the fossil fuel industries knew about this in the 1960s. I remember the day I listened and read it, and it drops into my heart. Gosh, we've known about this for 50 years and we didn't act. They knew for 50 years what they were doing and didn't act. And I can remember this sort of level of anger arising in my heart, if I'm very, very truthful. And so this is the journey that we're in at the moment, where actually, it's the waking up and the collective consciousness aspect of the whole of humanity, and that waking up and that collective consciousness is bigger than a faith tradition, or it's even, so that is the, and I think that's the bit we're wrestling with at the moment. So we either flip into denial and we kind of join the climate change deniers, or we sit here trying to protect our own particular quarter, which I think that's some of what's going on at the moment. But it's this, actually, the only solution is the moment where, sorry to go back to the lovely story, but I thought it was a great story, was the bit actually where the elephant has got to join in. And I think we've still got 10 or 15 years, I'm terrified, but I think it will only be when people who live on the seafront in Weymouth can no longer insure their houses, that at that point they may start taking climate change seriously. I mean, yeah. And so that's the bit that I feel such pain over, is that we didn't need to get here, yeah.
Martin Palmer, what are you hearing here? Yes, forward a little bit.
I was at Kyoto in '97.
Okay.
And we actually
the Kyoto, this was
the Kyoto protocol. Well, it was the first protocol. It was the first coordinated international response to climate change. As part of the bigger, and I'm with Anthony on this, we mustn't separate climate change out. Climate change is simply a symptom of a fundamental flaw. It is not the problem itself.
About our relationship.
Yeah, about our relationship with
there's lots of,
and if we just
if we decarbonise everything, we'd still have biodiversity disappearing.
We had a COP on biodiversity that nobody noticed. We've had a major summit, UN summit on food, nobody noticed. The danger of the climate movement is that it seems to think that it is the only story on the planet.
Yeah.
And it isn't, and it's bloody dangerous. It's a false story, and we need to actually put it back into its bigger context, which is that we are completely out of kilter in most of what we do, think, and the way we behave. And climate change is a symptom of that. It is not the cause of it.
Yeah.
It is not the only serious issue, and probably the food crisis is going to hit us earlier than climate will, as a part of the climate, but it'll hit us earlier. So I struggle with the overemphasis on climate change, because I think that lets us off the hook on many, many other things, and it kind of makes us think that if we stop using oil and petrol, if we do the fossil fuel thing, suddenly the planet will get back into being. The other problem, of course, is this planet was never designed for us.
No.
It's a huge arrogance to think that it ought to be doing what we need.
Exactly.
And that is one of the fundamental problems of much of the approach is, if we can only kind of re-engineer the planet, we'll be okay. Well, the planet doesn't give a monkey's ass for us. We're probably going to be a short-lived species anyway. The assumption that this was all done for us is theologically highly dubious, frankly, and has been a terrible myth within the Judeo-Christian tradition that has got us into this situation in the first place. And it's totally bewildering to the dharmic faiths of, say, Hinduism, Jainism, Taoism in particular, the Shinto, who just don't get it. They just don't get why we come at this issue in this, we can micro and mega manage this. I think the other issue too is that, frankly, religiously, the Church of England is probably the least effective church anywhere in the world dealing with this issue. And it causes me deep distress. I mean, we have an archbishop who doesn't give a damn about it. We haven't yet produced any coherent policy within the Anglican Church. We're on to the 6th commission studying what should we do. So it's pathetic. And I think the trouble is that we see that through the lens of I'm an Anglican as well, but it drives me to despair. Around the rest of the world, it is a very, very different story.
Tell us a little bit about that story, because those who don't know, didn't hear Martin perhaps speaking in an earlier session, Martin's work since the 1980s has been all about not only Christian, but other faiths and the environment in all sorts of different ways, educationally, in terms of, and he's now the chief executive of Faith Invest, which is a body that looks at bringing the massive resources of faiths across the world, encouraging them to review how they're using those resources, their investments, their land, their educational bodies, all sorts of things. That many of the hospitals of the world are run by faith bodies, in fact, and that's really the level at which you're working a lot of the time. So tell us, having had a bash at the Church of England.
Oh, always.
Well,
Well,
there's
around the
members
world,
of it. There's members of it that
we're
most
allowed
people
to.
do.
We're allowed to.
What do you see going on a wider scale, Martin?
Well, on a wider scale, I think I've been doing religion and environment work since 1979 and helped set up the first multi-faith education centre in inner city Salford, which was quite an experiment. I mean, my role was in religious education. I was advising the schools of the Northwest on RE. And it became very clear to me that the environmental crises that were already manifest to anybody who had eyes needed to be built thoroughly into the curriculum. And WWF asked me in 1981 whether I would create the first ever book for RE on faith and environment, which we call Worlds of Difference. And we looked at humanism as a belief system. We looked at the Yanomamo of the Amazon, Australian Aboriginals, Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, Taoism, Hinduism, Islam. And we explored, and this is very much Anthony's area, we explored the fact that we're not a data species. I mean, all this data stuff, I mean, really, it's utterly pointless. We are a narrative species. I mean, we've been talking this morning, and I've just learned he's 61, but that was only because it was important in the context of the story. I don't know how much you weigh. No idea how many calories you had for breakfast. I don't know how many miles you drove to get here, because that's not relevant to me working with you in relationship. You've told me the stories about how you've got to be where you are. We are a narrative species. And any attempt to bombard us with data just does not work. We've been doing that since 1992 on the data on climate change. It was only when we began to involve the arts, the storytellers, the faiths, as we did in 2015 at Paris, that we got to a point at which we were narrating a different story rather than chronicling the details of what we were doing. Because data is only as much use as the context within which it's set. A classic example of this is this year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the first UN conference on the environment at Stockholm. When the environmentalists went to Stockholm in '72, they were deeply anxious about deforestation. And so they presented the facts of the deforestation of the Amazon, the Congo, various other major forests in Indonesia, the Philippines, and so forth, assuming that the audience would go, oh my God, that's horrendous. How are we going to stop this? What actually happened was you had 196 governments there. And I would think probably about a fifth of those governments went home and said, you know, there are people who pay us for that crappy forest out there. And deforestation escalated as a direct result of an environmental conference because there was no understanding of the context. So what the faiths bring to this, and we did the first meeting, Prince Philip read the book I had written for schools. And in 1986, he asked me to bring together in Assisi the major faiths, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, for the first time, and they each had to write a 2,000-word statement of what they believed. Why do you think this is an issue? And it was the Franciscans who represented Christianity at the request of the Pope. And out of that came, and we brought every major environmental group there, who were completely bewildered as to what on earth this stuff that religions was to do about. I mean, we had revolts. And if it hadn't been for the status of Prince Philip just basically saying, no, I think this is important. We are not touching any hearts or minds. All we're doing is giving information. We're writing the longest suicide note in history. So out of that came then a whole alliance, and then we set up a group in 1995 called the Alliance for Religions Conservation. Every major faith in the world now has, and every major tradition, over 700, have now produced core statements. They have budgets set aside. They're looking at the resources. But the big shift that you were pointing to, Tony, was that for up until really about 2008, the assumption in the faiths and the assumptions by the secular movement was that we were there to protest, that we were there to point fingers, we were there to say, you know, why aren't you doing X, Y, and Z?
Government should do this. Business should do this.
And that business should do this, etc. I mean, very much it was also a Manichaean split, whereby, you know, we were good and business and governments and the were inexorably bad. And I kept saying, look, I'm a Christian. I believe in metanoia. I believe in salvation. I believe in liberation, redemption. Why are we treating this as though these camps can never change? Because if they can never change, well, we might as well just go and bury a hole and split in it. So what then began, we produced in 2007, the State of Religion Atlas that actually chronicled all the different things that the faiths manage. So their relationship with governments, which ones are official religions, their relationship with political parties, the land they own, the schools they run, the media they run, the hospitals they run. And it came back to us when we did this, which nobody had done before. Nobody had done an audit of what the faiths actually ran.
Data has its uses occasionally.
It does have its uses, but then the story has to be what?
The story has to be told.
Which is, we are stakeholders. So when we talk about, oh my God, the planet isn't paying any attention, 80 to 85% of the world's population claim to be following the major faiths. So we are the problem as faiths. We've not done a good job. Secondly, we are the fourth largest investing group in the world, and we've now got 1.1 trillion, 1.2 now actually, $1.2 trillion worth of religious investment that has now publicly committed, based on their beliefs, to shift into sustainable and environmental investment. We're now creating pipelines of projects. So taking seriously that we're not the innocent bystanders of a bad system, but we actually have the means at our disposal as faiths to change the situation by leadership. That's a big shift. And I saw that at COP, this COP. I have no problem with the protests and the petitions, but nobody reads the petitions. And the protests are lovely for the filming, but they have absolutely no effect on those structures. The governments are not going to be the major instruments for change. Taking place beside that was the civil society uprising, of basically saying, well, you know, if the governments eventually get round to joining us, that's lovely. But we, in terms of the faiths, in terms of the investors, in terms of business, in terms of health, in terms of education, we are going to create new partnerships and we will take the decisions. We're not going to wait for governments. We have the power to do this. Do a very simple exercise. We have a whole program called Faith Plans, and Othona is one of our partners in that. We did this first in 2008, 2009. We had 64 faith long-term plans, faith communities saying we will shift. We're now at 25,000. And we reckon we'll be possibly up to about 50,000 by the time we launch this in the summer. Very simple thing to do. Do an audit of what you actually influence. Very simple thing would be to get a group of 4 of us together like this. How many budgets do we have a right to have a say on? There's our personal budgets, there's our work budgets, there's our church budgets, there's our voluntary group budgets, there's the local clubs we belong to. On average, each of us has the power to influence somewhere between £3 to £6 million worth of spending per annum on material that makes a material difference to how we relate and manage the planet. So stop feeling useless, stop feeling it's somebody else's problem. We are both part of the problem and therefore part of the solution. And that's the big shift, to take seriously our stakeholder role and to not ask other people to do it, but to do it and then invite them. So the Pope's multi-faith statement that came out on October the 4th, we wrote the second half of that. The first half of it was the usual predictable faith statement, you know, we the religious leaders of the world tell everybody else what they should do, and nobody pays the slightest bit of attention. There's been one of those at every single COP since 2000 in Amsterdam. Pointless. Very nice. I mean, you actually feel slightly okay. You know,
better than them saying nothing.
No,
perhaps.
no,
Or is it
because
worse?
it's faith wash.
Ah, faith wash.
It's faith wash.
Greenwash. Yeah.
Faith wash.
Faith wash.
Faith wash, which is far more dangerous. Far more dangerous because it brings a slight glow of virtue.
Yeah.
Greenwash just simply says, oh yes, well, it's good for business. So faith wash is very dangerous. So what we then were able to do, and we wrote the second half of the statement, is to make this commitment of every major faith around the world, that they will develop big, ambitious plans, the Faith Plans program, the Laudate Si Action platform, which is one of our partners, the way that Arosha is increasing and pushing further as partners with us, the whole idea of eco-congregations, go further. But on top of that, that statement, signed and launched by all of them, including our dear beloved Archbishop, makes a commitment to move investments. Now, that is the first time at an international level, the faiths have actually said, well, it's all very well calling for everybody else to disinvest, and it's all very well disinvesting, that's fine, but where are you going to put it next? What are you going to do with it? Because we've settled back on a kind of raft of self-righteousness, but we've disinvested. Well, fine. So it means somebody else has come in and bought the shares instead. So what? What are you going to do with that money that will actually undermine the case for the use of fossil fuels by developing alternatives?
So constructive investment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what, for me and many of the people watching this, we think, well, I'm not sure what that would mean apart from.
Well, I'll give you two different, we're working at two different levels. So one level would be, we now have a whole collection of faith investment organizations around the world from every major faith, Shinto, Buddhist, Taoist, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, etc., etc. And between them, they probably represent somewhere in the region, and the sort of the group that's on the edge of this, something in the region of $4 trillion worth of investments, which represents about 3% of the total economy. But the religious investment world institutionally probably is 10%. And we know from research that 30% of investors are active members of religions. So potentially the reach of the faiths is to 40% of the total capital market is influenceable by faith. So we work at two different levels. One level is to work with religious development agencies, religious organizations who have been supporting projects like women's cooperatives, alternative technology organizations, particularly in the developing world, and saying, great, are there any projects where you've been giving them grants for years, which means you keep them in a servile state because they're entirely dependent on you, and where if we were to invest in them developing a business plan, and we were able to do due diligence on that plan, we could actually get them invested. So instead of making do with 2 sewing machines, they had 1,000. And instead of making do with, one little car that they run the stuff to the market, they have a branding process that brings together 500 cooperatives, as we're doing with small shareholder farmers in the Amazon, and then they can market better, they can get a better return.
So they become sustainable in themselves.
Precisely, that's the whole goal. It has to be. So for example, we're working with the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which works in 6 countries around the world, but they've been particularly successful in Colombia. Now what they have discovered is it's great. They've got laws in place, they've got land given back to indigenous people, local faith communities. The Catholics are obviously very strong in those areas. Then what? Do they enter into kind of a zoo where you don't touch anything because it's all supposed to be preserved, and these people die of hunger, and the young people drift away to the cities, and the whole thing falls apart? No, you've got to produce something they can make, that they can sell, that they can use sustainably. So you need to invest in the creation of jobs. That's at that level. So we're working on what are called small and medium scale projects, anywhere between about $100,000 through to say 5 million. We can put together a raft of those projects, and then the faith investors and others who are joining us, some of the big investment houses that have a religious basis, are kind of going, oh God, I suppose that's really what we're here for. So we're also attracting things like Friends Providence or Hawes Bank, an Anglican bank, so they're coming on board as well. That's at the small level.
It didn't sound very small, but
if you're going to make a substantial change, seriously, giving a grant of £1,000, no, that's not where the change is going to happen. It can help start showing that something can happen, but you've got to invest in change, not just demand it. And you've got to be just. You can't just simply say to a mining community, you're baddies, we're going to ban you from ever making coal again, and you're evil, look what you've done. You've got to say, okay, you've been trapped. We're going to free you, but we're going to give you jobs. So what are those jobs going to be? The second level we're working at is at a mega level, which is national infrastructure and international infrastructure. So with the World Bank, we are creating, well, rather with staff who want to get out of the World Bank because of its bureaucracy, we're creating a thing called the Just Transition Fund, which effectively would be a religious development bank. And here we have mega religious investors with, 40, 50 trillion dollars saying, okay, we'll come in and we'll give you $1 trillion to set up this fund. That then goes to mega scale. So that's doing things like working with making the whole of Brazil LED lighting, which you need enormous capital for. And we work on a process whereby the faith's development agencies come in as what's called concessionary funding. That means they will give money, which they were going to give us a grant anyway, but they were never going to get the money back. And if it helps a group get to a stage at which it's investable, which is probably 1 in every 10, then they're quite happy to lose the money on the other 9 because they'd have given the money anyway. And then we bring in the major investors from the faith communities, from faith families. There's a lot of faith families that want to make the shift. And what I see, what gives me hope, to be honest, Alasdair, is that there is this recognition in the financial world for all sorts of reasons, and not just financial, that this model is fundamentally broken, that there are viable alternatives. You can't just say to people to stop, because what the hell do they do? Mm. So you've got to find the alternatives, and we're creating pipelines of investable projects. We're using due diligence. We look at the environmental, the social, the structural impact of those things, and it's big scale. And what is exciting is that with the Pope's statement on October the 4th, signed by other major faiths, including, as I say, the Church of England, they are making a commitment that they will shift their assets, not just their emotions. Sorry, another one, Tim.
I've got a question I want to ask you. Going back to what you were saying in the very beginning about your own journey. This autumn, I went into a local sixth form college to do a day really talking with students about climate change, the environment, climate change, biodiversity, the whole blah, blah, blah. And we kind of did this sort of talk on it, and then we kind of came back and we did what we would call a people's assembly, or we did this sort of let's get into groups and talk about it. And out of the mouth of this young woman of 17 years old, I heard the most intelligent thing said, really, in all that I had been around, and I guess it goes back to dear old Paulo Freire. And she said to me, if this is happening, why the heck isn't my education all being challenged towards this particular, so I can live my life when this is all going on around me? And I thought it was interesting that you started a conversation within RE alone, was it, up in Salford? But I suppose the wider question I want to ask is, whilst there is the whole finance and investment and is the conversation going on in the realms of education and what's happening in relation to that in terms of
that's one of the biggest challenges. And I mean, the faiths run 50% of all schools worldwide. 64% of all schools, according to UNICEF, in sub-Saharan Africa are Christian, Muslim, or Hindu. So we've been working. The UK is very difficult. The UK is very difficult with regards to religion generally. We are very unhappy about talking about religion. Almost nowhere else in the world do I find that. Even in the most secular countries, for example, Sweden, it's, along with the Netherlands, probably the least practicingly religious, but my God, they will talk about religion, they will draw on its resources. We kind of go, oh no, that's private. So we're a bit odd, to put it mildly. And when we do the State of Religion Atlas, we've done it twice, we're about to do a third one, we have to acknowledge there is a thing called Northwest Europe exceptionism, where everywhere else talks about religion and it's a vibrant part of their lives, but Northwest Europe is just an intellectual idea and an occasional thing for Christmas or festivals or rites of passage. So it's a difficult one, but yes, a quarter of the entire religious education curriculum is now environmental, but it's not very good. Because RE itself is not very good, because it's poorly served in terms of finance, support and training and so forth. Around the world, we are targeting the faith's religious instruction, or rather the education staff. So if we take East Africa, for example, the Catholic Church has 10,000 schools in Kenya. The Anglicans have 7,000, the Muslims have about 2,000, the Methodists 500, the Hindus, particularly the Aga Khan Foundation, about another 250. So with them, and this has now spread throughout East Africa and has gone over also to Nigeria, Ghana, etc. We've worked with UNICEF, who have a program called Education for Sustainable Development. And this is the big international program on environmental awareness for schools. And most of the developing world have adopted it, but not the developed world.
Right.
And we produced the first ever faith-based toolkit for education for sustainable development for Kenya. It's now part of the official curriculum of Kenya and spread to Tanzania, Uganda, and it's going elsewhere. And very interesting moment, the head of this wonderful Catholic sister, Sister Mary, who helped develop this with Muslim, Christian and Hindu leaders in Kenya, was invited to the international meeting of the Education for Sustainable Development in Japan about 6 years ago. And someone stood up, a Brit, stood up and said, so what's the difference? I mean, you know, seriously, what's the difference between the ordinary Education for Sustainable Development teacher's kitchen and a faith one? And Mary said, and I think this for me captures the heart of what we're doing. She said, we start by saying thank you. Mm. You start by telling us how it's all shit.
Mm. Mm. That's very interesting.
So answering your question, the resources are there, but we have an education system which has nothing to do with educating. It's to produce people who will fit into the machine. It's called stats.
Yeah.
So we're cobbled by that.
Yeah. Some of you may have come across something called the work that reconnects, which is an approach to looking at our relationship to the environment and how that impacts us, particularly emotionally and spiritually. It's something that is very much connected with Joanna Macy, who I dare say some people have read. And that's been developed, gradually evolved over 30, 40 years. And it's very informed by her Buddhist understanding. But that, again, always starts with gratitude.
Exactly.
Always starts from the position of gratitude and our sense of simply blessedness around and in our lives and in the world, and then looks at the grief and what we may be able to do and all the other personal shifts, and is also communitarian. This isn't about, and I think I'm feeling more and more passionately myself that as many people are at different times scared or bewildered or whatever, that the way forward needs to be in community in one sense or another. It isn't about individual therapy, which is a strong model in the West, but individualism got us where we are, and it's certainly not the way out.
It's very interesting. There's a big movement within the UN world and to some extent the faith world, which is common people for people and planet. And it's being led by the International Social Work Network, who have basically had to fight their way back out of social work being seen as individual well-being, and to recognize that in most cases they ought to be redundant if they could enable communities to be the caring structures, and that should be their goal.
And so many communities have fractured because of changing industry, because of housing, certainly in the West.
Well, if you take the faith plans, for example, faith plans, we don't take individuals. It has to be a community group that says this. So if we look at the partnership we have with the Laudate Si movement, the big Catholic movement, which has got 5,000 faith plan groups in it, everything from Jesuit universities to parish churches, it cannot just be an individual, because that's not got sustainability. It's got to be a community that's made that decision in the same way that you were saying. Build ecology in along with safeguarding into what a community takes community responsibility for. That's fundamental. Fundamental.
We've got about a quarter of an hour more. In a few minutes, I'm going to see if there are people wanting to make comments or ask questions from out there on Zoom. On this occasion, can we ask you principally, oh, thank you, we've got a link up for Joanna Macy there. Leah's put on the screen, on the chat screen, if you want to see, and all our links are coming up on that chat sidebar. While you think whether there's something you'd like to comment on, and I'll ask you principally, please, to just indicate in the chat that you do have something you'd like to say, and then we'll try and come to you live. Okay, but first, I wanted to say to you, Martin, I strongly suspect that to almost everybody listening to this, all you've said is news about what's going on. Does it matter that most of us are totally unaware of the kind of things that you believe, are beginning to happen on this mega and fairly high scale? I mean, is it all happening behind boardroom doors? Is it just another version of that, but with faith people then?
Yeah, that's a good question. It very much depends where you are as to whether this is news or not. We've always had a very good relationship with the BBC. We do a great deal of stuff with the BBC, get material out there. But it often is, as you will know from your own BBC experience, a bit of sort of comforting water off the duck's back. But in certain areas, so if I give a very simple example, China, we have worked for many, many years as partners with the major Taoist and Buddhist networks in China, also to a lesser extent with the Protestant Christian traditions, and the Catholic one is a very complicated one. And in China, the role of the faith is now so fundamental to the environmental solutions that in the most recent 5-year plan launched by the Chinese Communist Party back in 2020, a major section of responsibility for environmental education, for environmental practice and modeling is being given to the Taoists with a lesser extent to the Buddhists. So in that country, where civil society has been almost extinguished by President Xi, the work that the Taoists in particular have done now for almost 30 years has been so honored because it has actually delivered results that nobody else could do in a command economy, in a command dictatorship. And because it's traditional, and the emphasis of President Xi is on traditional Chinese values, it is actually the only significant sector of civil society active on the environment still. And so important that it is included, and we have multiple partnerships there. Another example would be the Punjab, where Eco-Sikh, the big Sikh environmental movement, has been so effective. It was behind the lobbying against the new agricultural bill, which was coming in, which would have destroyed all smallholder farms. And this was led by Eco-Sikh. It has changed, the government has dropped it, but at the same time, Eco-Sikh has been developing a whole reforestation program, which brings economies into local communities. And again, the Punjab government has basically said, this must be our policy for the Punjab. East Africa, I've already referenced. There are so many places. Indonesia would be another one. Indonesia was one of the worst countries for deforestation. and also for the illegal wildlife trade, because it has rhino, it has many endangered species, pangolin and so forth. The Muslims brought out, again with our assistance, the first ever fatwa. Now, fatwa is an absolute teaching in Islam. If you go against this teaching, you go to hell. And in 2015, they brought out the first ever fatwa on environmental issues, and it was a complete ban on the use of endangered species. The next year, it was on the burning of tropical rainforests or the illegal logging of rainforests. And that now is the policy of the Indonesian government, is that this is now Islamic practice, not questionable. If you don't do the right things, you are out of community with Islam, and the community of Islam is the Ummah, the fundamental backbone. So again, I'll come back to Sweden. The Church of Sweden's investment board has been the most active group supporting green bonds, investing in things that look pretty shaky, but which have proved to be the backbone of actually creating an alternative economy. So it's going on. In some places, it's very public. In other places, it's very quiet. And I'm on the Pope's COVID Commission. It's rather fun being an Anglican. I keep saying, when he's ready, we'll take him back. It's okay, we can forgive the past. So far not taken up much, sadly. No. But we are working there on hearing back from how the church, the Catholic Church, has been working through COVID and other issues, and shattering this myth that we're all in this together. No, we're not. If you've got private income, you're not in this together. It's a total myth. The injustice of that statement is shocking. And it is the faith, Catholic Church in particular, that has been saying, no, if you are a poor landless peasant in El Salvador, or if you are a migrant trying to get out of Egypt or wherever, or Iraq, to secure the future of your family, we're not all in this together. Let's shatter that myth. So I think, Tony, some of it is going on quietly, particularly the financial side goes on quietly, because every religion is slightly embarrassed that they don't just live simply according to the Spirit and are moved by the Spirit. So the whole God Mammon thing is slightly difficult, although the Chinese have a slightly different approach, and we helped develop the first ever fully ecological pilgrimage city in the world in China in the early 2010s. And it's massive, it's incredible. It generates all its own energy, it grows all its own food, and it's dealing with something like 250,000 visitors per weekend, and is able to deal with that and feed them and house them and transport and all the rest of it. But they built a new temple. I read classical Chinese, so they built a new temple as part of this complex. And the sign in Chinese, just showing where you turn off to it, simply says the temple of the god of wealth, health and longevity, which are the three great things in Chinese belief. In English, this was translated as temple of God and Mammon.
Great. It's time to see whether some of you have, I'm afraid we've only got 10 minutes left, but Martin, we could have a whole separate session with you one day about China.
Indeed.
But please, comments, questions arising from what you've heard, particularly from Alasdair and from Martin, please. What are we seeing on the chat? Anybody indicating that they've got something they would like to actually say live, but flag up on the chat that you would like to do that. Jane Davis says, always good to hear Martin Palmer. I heard him at a something event, can't read that, in Bristol many years ago, where I learned about the significance of place and sacred space and town geography and so much more. That was the start of a new journey. Now I see, oh, Jane's actually got her hand up there. Do you want to talk to us live, Jane? Unmute yourself if you will.
Oops, not unmuting.
Unmuted.
You're still muted at the moment, Jane. I
pressed the thingy. I think it was a festival of ideas. That's what I meant by FOI. It doesn't really matter who hosted it, but it was from the watershed, and we walked around the city, and he told us the significance of where the churches were. It's off at a tangent from what's been happening this morning, but it was obviously important for me because I've remembered it all these years on.
Okay, thank you, Jane. I see a hand raised from Paul Fox. Paul, do you want to unmute yourself and speak to us?
Yes, well, one of the faiths that hasn't been mentioned is the American Fundamentalist Church, which is a quite frightening action now, because I think through Trump, they support Trump, and they've more or less taken over the Republican Party. They're extremely powerful, and they don't believe in climate change, that they don't believe it's actually happening. And I do know one
I have to break in on that
acquaintance who's very much involved in the evangelistic church, and brings this up on his website regularly.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I think a lot of people are very concerned about the influence of American evangelicalism, not only in North America, but particularly in South America as well. Martin.
Well, Paul, hey, nice to see you, mate, after many years. The World Evangelical Alliance, 600 million members, something like 1,700 universities around the world, has now created a whole department on it, creation care, which is based around that season that we were able to bring into being. They have struggled for a very long time with what is actually a relatively small group within the evangelical tradition who have turned their back on this. The very first time I spoke publicly after we'd done the Assisi event in '86 was at Berkeley, at the Union Theological College in '87, and there were over 500 protesters outside barracking, trying to break into the room to stop me talking, on the grounds that the environmental crisis was a forerunner of the return of Christ, as predicted in Revelation.
Therefore a good thing.
Therefore a good thing. Now, that approach, and I remember trying to converse with them, but my understanding of the Bible is somewhat different from theirs. And I just realized at that point that until somebody came up within that tradition and could use the stories, the biblical stories, in their way, I was worse than useless, because I didn't believe their story. And so what then happened was an amazing guy called Jim Ball, Reverend Jim Ball, in the mid-90s came up with a bumper sticker. Now, this is America. I mean, this is as close to literature as they get, basically. And the bumper sticker said, "What would Jesus drive?" And once you start, it's back to what Anthony was telling us. You've got to find the story that unlocks the heart. And me, as a liberal Anglican, could not unlock that heart. And the danger for us as liberal Anglicans is that we want to dismiss that story, and that's driven some of them, not just us, but much of the world has dismissed them. Very interesting conversation, just very briefly, very briefly.
Into the arms of Trump.
Into arms of Trump. Very interesting comment. We were doing a session at COP on fear, eco-fear. And one of the things that I realized quite a long time ago was that actually fundamentalist evangelicals had really noticed that this was terrifying, what was happening to the planet. They were aware of what was happening decades before most people were. Their response was to say, "Oh my God, well, thank God it's in Jesus's hands, and this is all part of God's plan." So instead of seeing it that they rejected what they were hearing, they reacted in one particular way, which an awful lot of people have done. "Oh, we'll leave it to the market. Oh, it's in the hands of Jesus. Don't worry, Allah has determined." So very often the faith response has been to go, "Wow, this is bloody scary. Let's retreat." What we've been doing is saying, "Yes, you're right, it's bloody scary. What does your tradition say about actually dealing with this degree of fear? How do we overcome it?" After all, we're the most sustainable organizations in the world, the faith. We've been around for millennia. We will be around for millennia.
Alasdair, I think you wanted to come in on this.
Yes, I'm a recovering evangelical. So I spent over 20 years in the evangelical tradition. My background prior to being an Anglican, I was a Pentecostal pastor.
Oh, right.
And within that, I mean, evangelical is a really broad term. I think if you talk to most British evangelicals, you know, I encounter the odd climate change denier among them. I think if you talk to most Anglican evangelicals, they would probably not be. They would just be, it's more of a priority issue for them. So, you know, the conversion of souls is still their primary place. When we're talking with the what we call American evangelicals, is actually probably, I think it's almost another faith entirely, in that what we're talking about is the prosperity movement within the evangelical wing of the church in America. And those are
the prosperity gospel.
The prosperity gospel. So those guys, they are driven by capitalism. And so, you know, they've empowered Trump, they've empowered that whole narrative, they're going there. So here's where I would go as a recovered evangelical is go back to the Bible, go back to the story of Genesis, go back to, you know, the final chapters of Revelation, go back to the flood, all of those, and I think re-engage ourselves with the Bible through the lens of our creation is good. Christ so loved the world. You know, I remember when I first woke up, that John 3:16 didn't just mean people.
Yes.
And so
inhabited
Christ loved the world.
Yeah. God so loved the world. You know, God was, you know, the salvation story is not just one. And then I think also some of their gurus. So, for example, I remember when I first read Tom Wright's Surprised by Hope, and then obviously when I was at college I read his Resurrection of the Son of God, I began to revisit what the resurrection meant. And so it's about the restoration of all of creation. It's actually not just a resurrection of human beings for judgment or whatever you want to go. Actually, it's a story of it. And so I think I think for us as liberals, and I probably put myself in the liberal camp, I don't know where I put myself half the time, but my argument would be is go back to the Bible and engage with Scripture to tell this story of where we are today in a good way. But I think it's drawing on story is the powerful tool within which to talk at.
And it's happening. It's happening.
Yeah.
They've now created a whole section within the World Evangelical Alliance to do precisely that, and then to be proactive on environmental issues. It's a big shift, but there are some loonies around. But then, so there are in any faith.
I mean, I encountered it up at COP26. You know, I had people coming up to me and saying that I was a pagan now and I was no longer a Christian and all this kind of stuff. And I just took a leaf out of the Scottish Comedian's book and just said, enjoy your day, mate, you know, and just, you know, I just didn't, if I was truthful, I just kind of let it go. I think there are, one of the places I was most encouraged was with the Eden Pentecostal Church, which is, you know, they produced an absolutely superb video on climate change just prior to COP26. And what was so wonderful was the speakers were coming from the Southern Hemisphere. So they were talking as Pentecostal Christians, what they were doing in Africa and how they were engaging with climate change. And so, you know, it's more geographical than branding a whole brand of Christianity as the bad guys.
As a lost cause.
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Friends, we're coming to the end of our allotted time. There is much more we could have carried on discussing, but we've been going together for quite a while this morning. Thank you very much. I hope everybody's had a chance at home also to see some of the other comments coming up on the chat there. I just want to read before it disappears, in case some people can't see it, what a leader has written. Very grateful to hear you all talk so clearly. Thank you. And catastrophes can be prevented, prepared for, responded to, mitigated and recovered from. Fear is realistic, but cannot be allowed to be overwhelming. And I so agree. If we live in fear, it is no life. Well, we want to encourage that in others. On we go, she says, with deep gratitude to your sharing, dear Anthony, Alasdair, Martin, and Tony. And then signs off from this companion stakeholder, which we all are. And companions, as the word company happens, the word that stands behind all the companies that we interact with in the world is about kumpane. It's the people you break bread with. And we're going to go and break bread together in a moment, socially distanced along the corridor. And I hope that you'll be breaking bread. And thank you, because in spirit, we've all been communing together, I think, on this Zoom. Do join us again if you can at 5 o'clock this evening, when our focus will be on food and the planet, food and farming. We have not only farmers from West Bexington, the organic farm, with us, but also I'm glad to say we'll be hearing from Lynn Birmingham, who, among other things, coordinates Bridport Vegan Market. It is Veganuary. We're going to hear a little bit about the vegan lifestyle. Remember, if you do want to donate in recognition of this series, there's a button for that, which you can see on the chat as well. And at some stage, what you've heard this morning will be available by YouTube if you want to share it with other people. Thank you again.
Thank you very much,
Martin, Alasdair, and Anthony. And we hope to see you later today, or possibly tomorrow morning, when we hear from a rewilder and reintroducer, a man who knows his beaver from his water vole, because he reintroduces them both, and he is a great listener, I'll tell you. Okay, thank you. We can close the Zoom, I think. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for your presence.